For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motsabi Hwayane. Political analyst Aubrey Majiki joins me to discuss the role that racial census plays in South Africa's socio-political sphere ahead of the 2014 elections. Firstly, do you think the rhetoric of race is still relevant within the South African socio-political scheme of things, especially after 20 years into the country's democracy?
Well, there are political parties in this country that benefit from the coincidence between race and voting patterns. Over the past few days, actually, we've had a row because the deputy president of the African National Congress argued that if people do not vote for the ANC, the Boers will come back. Of course, that is open to many interpretations. He could have meant that the National Party government will come back. You and I know that's not going to happen. And therefore, people are left with only one interpretation, that he was using scaremongering tactics to the effect that there are parties in this country that are seen by some black voters as being parties that represent white interests, and therefore he was warning black voters in particular about such parties. Now, such tactics, of course, may win elections, may win votes, but in terms of the more important project of nation building, the reconciliation project and so on, we must ask questions about the negative impact they might have.
Do you think discussions by some parties like the ANC and EFF based on race in South Africa are authentic, or are they just shock tactics intended to garner votes?
Well, they're a bit of both, in the sense that the lived reality of many black people is a lived reality of underdevelopment. And therefore, when even the ANC concedes that there is a gap between what has been promised and what has been delivered so far, or when the economic freedom fighters point out to the poor social and economic conditions of the young people in particular, the working class and the poor, they are speaking to a lived reality that is quite familiar to many black people. And therefore that messaging resonates with them. But at the same time, of course, there is an element of the opportunistic in exploiting particular sentiments and the lived reality as a vote-catching exercise.
You state in your article that both the ANC and the DA are two sides of the same racial coin. Can you elaborate on this, and how do you interpret the DA's recent flip-flop on employment equity?
Well, since 1994, there's been quite a strong coincidence between race and election results. And that is going to continue in the foreseeable future. Despite some slight change in that coincidence with regard to the number of black voters who have become prepared to vote for the Democratic Alliance. But overall, that coincidence is going to remain intact. Now, the two parties that have benefited the most from this coincidence between race and election outcomes are the Democratic Alliance and its predecessors and the African National Congress. It is to that extent that I argue that they are two sides of the same racial coin.
And how do you interpret the DA's recent flip-flop on employment equity?
Well, that was a gift to the ANC, because the context in which the DA operates is an electoral space where it has hit a ceiling amongst its own traditional support base. In order to grow in 2014 and beyond, it must win significant support amongst black people. Now, there are many black people who instinctively and otherwise feel that the DA is a party of white interests. Objectively, they may be wrong, but that is their subjective orientation, and that subjective orientation has been reinforced by this flip-flop and the fact that the DA tends to be ambivalent or ambiguous about issues such as BEE and affirmative action.
Why do you think the question of race would still be influential in the electoral decisions that South Africans will make in 2014?
Well, history, or the past, is still part of the present. And I must confess that it is my view that it can be argued quite credibly that race relations are not where they should be. But the fact that the reconciliation project is not attached as strongly as it should be to the amelioration of the social and economic conditions of those who are oppressed reinforces this idea that to be born white is still to be born to a position of advantage, and to be born black, it is still the case that you are born into a position of disadvantage. Now, of course, reconciliation, if it must work, must also be about the amelioration of the social and economic conditions, particularly economic conditions of those who are oppressed during apartheid. And therefore, or if we don't do that, it will be very difficult to succeed with reconciliation. And if poverty, unemployment, and inequality persist, and black people bear the brunt of these negative social and economic indicators, it will be very difficult to reconcile.
Why would you say that if elections devolve into a racial census, this would have the effect of eroding democracy in South Africa?
You know, we fought for a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. I am convinced that all of the people of this country, black and white, have a common destiny. And therefore, it is to be quite short-sighted. It is to cut our noses, to spite our faces, not to realize that we have a common destiny, and to engage in forms of national behavior that undermine the potential of this country to work, because all its people are working together and pulling together. Now, of course, if the racial census element of our elections continues, that will be a reflection of the fact that in society as a whole, we are not succeeding in having black and white people uniting behind a common vision for this country, which means, therefore, the challenges that we face, we are not going to face successfully if we can't unite behind a common vision for our future. More importantly, racial conflict will flare up from time to time, undermine nation-building projects, but more importantly, undermine our democratic experience as citizens. Because to live in a country for too long, where its elections have a strong element of a racial census, undermines our democratic experience as citizens who must work together to build that democracy.
When do you think that the relation between race and voting patterns in South Africa will be broken?
Well, it can be gradual over a period of time when voters opt for alternatives to both the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that generational factors may impact positively on this coincidence between race and voting patterns. But I am gravitating quite strongly towards the view that in future, voters will look at both the Democratic Alliance and the ANC and come to the conclusion that neither of them represents the future, in which case they will not only look for alternatives, but will create alternatives that will take the country in a different direction.
That was political analyst Aubrey Machiku discussing race and voting patterns in South Africa.